The Vanishing Hour by Agatha Christie. What if the supernatural isn't just a myth, but a force lurking so close it could change everything you know about reality? Sir Henry Clithing, once the sharpest mind at Scotland Yard, couldn't explain it, but Miss Marple could. With a mere glance, she saw through every mystery, no matter how impossible it seemed. And now, something darker than a ghost is about to unfold. In the quiet corners of an old English mansion, where the past whispers in every shadow, a mystery unfolds that defies explanation. Sir Henry Clithing, a man who had solved the most complicated crimes of his time, now finds himself humbled by an unlikely adversary, an elderly woman with a mind sharper than any detective. Miss Marple, the unassuming spinster, has seen it all, or so it seems. But tonight, as the clock ticks closer to midnight, even her extraordinary powers will be tested. And when the supernatural knocks at the door, no one will be prepared for the truth that lies hidden in the dark. Imagine the eerie silence of an old English dining room, the kind that makes your skin crawl, no matter how many times you've been inside it. Sir Henry Clithing, the ex-commissioner of Scotland Yard, was sitting in the old Bantry mansion, sipping his drink as his hostess, Mrs. Bantry, gazed at him with curiosity. They were surrounded by old friends, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, when Sir Henry dropped a bombshell. He leaned in, his voice low, as he spoke of a woman who had completely outsmarted him every single time. "Do you know Miss Marple?" Sir Henry asked, his eyes twinkling with mystery. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. Of all the things Sir Henry could ask, this was the last question she'd ever expect. "Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion. "The old maid?" But Sir Henry wasn't joking. "Exactly," he said, his voice serious. "She's not just any old lady. When I was down here last year, we started discussing unsolved mysteries, and she solved every one of them, without even blinking. Straight to the truth, every time. Just like a homing pigeon." At this point, the room grew tense. Miss Marple, the unassuming, quiet woman who'd been sitting in the corner, became the center of attention. Mrs. Bantry was skeptical, but Sir Henry was insistent. "She may seem harmless, but there's something extraordinary about her," he said. "Miss Marple has spent years observing human nature, quietly watching, quietly listening, and she knows more than anyone could possibly imagine." As Mrs. Bantry pondered, she suddenly had an idea. What if we tested her with George Pritchard's ghost story after dinner? George Pritchard, most prosaic man you could imagine, according to Colonel Bantry, had a problem that had troubled him for years. A problem that nobody could explain. The most eerie, unsettling story of a ghost. But could it be true? Or was George losing his mind? And then, Colonel Bantry, who was usually a man of logic and reason, revealed the chilling details. His voice grew quieter as he spoke. George's wife was difficult. Very difficult. She had a sickness, a condition, but she used it to manipulate him, demand his attention, and tear him apart. She was a nightmare for him. And then, well, strange things began happening, ghostly, unexplainable events. As the conversation grew more intense, everyone around the table leaned in. But no one was prepared for what would happen next. Miss Marple, the quiet observer, began to speak. With a calm, almost eerie certainty, she laid out the truth. Not just about George's story, but about the dark secrets hidden beneath the surface of the Bantry house. Secrets that could change everything. What if George isn't the only one being haunted? Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her words cut through the air like a dagger. What if there's something even darker at play here? And as the clock ticked in the cold, dimly lit dining room, a shiver ran down everyone's spine. The ghost story wasn't just a story, it was a warning. What if a simple fortune teller's warning holds the key to something far darker than you ever imagined? George Pritchard, a man who had lived a life of logic and reason, was about to be dragged into a world where every corner seemed to harbor a sinister secret. And it all began with his wife's obsession, an obsession with fortune tellers, psychic readers, and mysterious warnings. Mrs. Pritchard had always been drawn to the mystical world, the world of fortune tellers, palmists, and clairvoyants. George, though a man of science and logic, had always humored her. Let her have her fun, he thought. If she finds some amusement in it, then so be it. But one thing was certain. He would never partake in such nonsense himself. And that, of course, became another bone of contention between the two of them. The tension in the house was palpable, each passing day filled with the constant revolving door of nurses who came and went, as Mrs. Pritchard grew increasingly dissatisfied with each one. But there was one nurse, Nurse Copling, who was different. Nurse Copling was experienced, calm, and indifferent to the melodramatic tantrums of Mrs. Pritchard. She didn't flinch when Mrs. Pritchard threw her usual fits, when the poor woman's health and nerves seemed to collapse under the weight of her own whims. But today, Nurse Copling had plans of her own. She was going to visit her sister in Gold's Green. George, who had plans for a round of golf, could hardly hide his relief. The last thing he wanted was to be involved in his wife's latest psychic obsession. "Don't worry, Mr. Pritchard," Nurse Copling reassured him with a knowing smile. "Neither of us will be missed today. Mrs. Pritchard has other, more exciting company." "Exciting company?" George's curiosity piqued. "Who's that?" Nurse Copling's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Zira, the psychic reader of the future." "Zira?" George scoffed, shaking his head. "Sounds like something out of a bad novel." Nurse Copling only smiled knowingly. "I believe my predecessor introduced Mrs. Pritchard to her. She's coming this afternoon." George shrugged it off. "Well, I suppose she'll get her money's worth," he muttered, heading off to his golf game with a sense of lightheartedness. Little did he know, this innocent afternoon would be the beginning of something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hours later, George returned home, eager to relax, but what he found was anything but peaceful. Mrs. Pritchard was in a state of absolute agitation, her face pale, eyes wide with panic. She lay on her couch, clutching a bottle of smelling salts as though it were her only lifeline. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her words sending a chill down George's spine. "George, I told you the moment I stepped into this house, there was something wrong. Something evil." George, trying to hide his growing unease, responded with the only thing he could think of. "You always say that, Mary." But Mrs. Pritchard was beyond reason now. Her voice dropped lower, as though recounting a dark secret she couldn't escape. This woman, this psychic, she knew. She could feel the evil here, the danger. The moment she stepped in, she turned pale. She said it herself. "There is evil here, and it's dangerous." George chuckled nervously, dismissing it as another one of his wife's fantasies. "Well, I'm sure it's just the theatrics of a fortune teller. You've had your fun, Mary." But Mary wasn't finished. "No, George. She wasn't just a fortune teller. She told me something else, something more sinister." George raised an eyebrow. "What else?" Mrs. Pritchard's voice lowered to a whisper. "She pointed to the violets I had in the vase and said, 'Take those away. No blue flowers. Never have blue flowers. Blue flowers are fatal to you. Mr. Pritchard, please, you need to come. Mrs. Pritchard is terribly upset. She's received a letter, and it's shaken her to her core." George followed Nurse Copling upstairs, his heart already heavy with the knowledge that something wasn't right. When he found his wife, she was sitting there, trembling, clutching a letter tightly in her hands, as if it were her only anchor to reality. "Read it, George," she insisted, her voice quivering. "You have to read it." George took the letter cautiously. It was on thick, heavily scented paper, the kind that made you dizzy with the sweetness. The writing was bold and stark, as though the words themselves were meant to shout, to warn. Suspenseful letter reading. "I have seen the future. Be warned before it's too late. Beware of the full moon. The blue primrose means warning. The blue hollyhock means danger. The blue geranium means death." George felt a laugh bubbling up, but something about the atmosphere stopped him cold. He glanced at Nurse Copling, and the warning in her eyes made his smile falter. "Mary, this woman is probably just trying to frighten you," George said, trying to sound reassuring, though the words felt hollow. "There's no such thing as blue primroses or blue geraniums. This is just nonsense." But his wife wasn't listening. She was crying now, her tears falling freely as she muttered, "My days are numbered, George." "I know it." Nurse Copling followed him out into the hall, her face pale. "Mr. Pritchard, this is all so strange. I don't believe in psychics or fortune-telling, but there's something off about this woman. She's not after money. She's just scaring Mrs. Pritchard for no reason I can understand." George frowned. "You don't think there's any truth to it, do you?" "No," Nurse Copling replied firmly. "I don't believe in the supernatural. But this is different. Mrs. Pritchard says Zara's face. There was something about her that seemed familiar. That's what bothers me most." 4 days later, the unthinkable happened. It was early in the morning when Mrs. Pritchard rang the bell violently, her panic echoing through the house. The household rushed to her room, expecting the usual drama, but what they found was something that would haunt George for the rest of his life. Mrs. Pritchard was pointing at the wallpaper with frantic energy, her voice shaking. There it is." George followed her finger, his heart sinking as his eyes locked onto the wallpaper. Among the brightly colored flowers, bluebells, daffodils, and lupins, was something that should not have been there. A single, impossibly out-of-place, blue primrose. The room fell silent. Miss Helia, the nurse, was the first to speak. "But Mrs. Pritchard, was that blue primrose always there?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Of course it wasn't," Mrs. Pritchard snapped, her eyes wild with fear. "It wasn't there before, it's never been there, and last night there was a full moon." George tried to keep his composure. "Mary, this is ridiculous. It's just a coincidence. There's no such thing as a cursed flower." But Mrs. Pritchard was beyond reason. She clutched her chest, her breath shallow. "You don't understand, George. The blue primrose means danger. The blue flowers are a warning." Mrs. Bantry, who had heard about the incident, was just as shaken. She recalled her visit to Mrs. Pritchard's room, trying to calm the woman, but instead feeling a deep unease. "I tried to dismiss it, tried to make light of it," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice still tinged with uncertainty. "But something about it didn't sit right." She paused, her brow furrowing. "I met George Pritchard that day and told him about it. He laughed it off, of course, but when I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on." And then Mrs. Bantry shared something that made her blood run cold. "I met Jean Instow soon after. She's a strange girl, but what she said, it unsettled me." Mrs. Bantry took a deep breath. "Jean told me something chilling. Well, maybe this is all for the best. Maybe it's better if Mrs. Pritchard does die." "Die?" Mrs. Bantry had echoed in disbelief. Jean had smiled coldly. "Yes. What use is her life to anyone? It would be a relief, for George, for everyone." Mrs. Bantry was stunned. You can't be serious." But Jean's expression didn't change. "What's so terrible about it? It's not like anyone cares for her. She's just a burden." As Mrs. Bantry retold this conversation, a creeping dread began to settle in. Was it possible that the so-called curse wasn't just superstition? Or had something darker, more deadly, begun to take root in Mrs. Pritchard's life? And as George Pritchard stood in the midst of all these strange and unsettling events, one question echoed through his mind. Was this truly a warning from the future? Or was someone trying to drive his wife to madness? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, as though she was savoring the mystery. "Yes, dear," she said placidly, "one always does. But tell me, is Miss Instow a pretty girl?" "Well, yes, she's quite the looker," Mrs. Bantry replied, her voice hesitant but curious. "Fair, with a healthy glow to her skin and those piercing blue eyes. You know, George Pritchard, well, I always thought they'd have made a great couple. If only things had been different." "Ah, they were friends?" Miss Marple asked, raising an eyebrow. "Great friends," Mrs. Bantry confirmed, her tone carrying a mixture of fondness and something more, something unspoken. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat, eager to steer the conversation back to the heart of the matter. "Well, Dolly, I would appreciate it if I could continue with my story." "Arthur," Mrs. Bantry sighed, "you're so eager to get back to your ghosts." "Go on, then," Colonel Bantry continued, his voice low, as if recounting a dark memory. "There's no doubt that Mrs. Pritchard became increasingly obsessed with the letter. She marked the full moon on her calendar, counting down the days. And on that fateful night she made sure both the nurse and George were present in her room. George's disbelief was evident, but the tension in the air was palpable. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why are we doing this? There's no blue flower here. There can't be." But when he left the room, reluctantly, the unthinkable happened. The next morning, as Nurse Copling entered Mrs. Pritchard's room, her voice trembled with shock. George, look at this." There, on the wallpaper. A solitary, unmistakable blue hollyhock nestled among the pinks and reds. George froze, his mind scrambling to make sense of it. "No, it's a trick. It has to be." But even Nurse Copling was disturbed. This can't be a coincidence." George refused to be swayed. He stormed out of the room. "I won't let you get carried away, Mary," he snapped. "It's all some absurd, stupid joke." But something was breaking within him, a seed of doubt. For the first time, George couldn't deny it. He was being forced to face the idea that the impossible was happening in front of his eyes. The fateful night came. Mrs. Pritchard locked herself in her room, eerily calm and almost in a trance. Nurse Copling was beside herself, sensing something was terribly wrong, but unable to stop it. "I think she's enjoying this," Nurse Copling whispered to herself. "Like a grim theater, a show she's been cast in." But the morning brought the chilling silence. Mrs. Pritchard, are you—" The nurse's voice trailed off as she saw the still form on the bed. There was no response, no movement. The room felt heavy, suffocating. Breaking down the door with a chisel, they found Mrs. Pritchard's lifeless body, a grotesque stillness in the air. But what made it even worse, beside her, one of the once pink geraniums had turned a deep, unsettling blue. "God help us," Nurse Copling whispered, a shiver running down her spine. This isn't just a coincidence anymore." Sir Henry leaned in, frowning. "But what about the gas? Wasn't there some gas involved?" Mrs. Bantry quickly replied, "The doctor did find a slight smell of gas when he arrived, but it was barely noticeable." He concluded that it wasn't enough to have killed her, The shock didn't end there. George, in his panic, confessed that he had noticed a strange feeling, a queer sensation when he entered the room. "But I thought it was just shock," he said, shaking his head. "I couldn't place it." "Let me tell you," Colonel Bantry said darkly, his voice laden with the weight of the story. "There was gossip, lots of it. Servants overheard more than they should have. They heard Mrs. Pritchard tell George," he paused, "that she was convinced he hated her. And do you know what she said to him just before?" Mrs. Bantry's voice cracked. "She said, 'When I'm dead, I hope everyone realizes you killed me.'" The whispers of servants only added to the horror. George had been mixing weed killer the day before. One of the younger servants had seen him, then saw him give Mrs. Pritchard a glass of hot milk. The talk started spreading. "It's like the world's closing in on him," Mrs. Bantry added gravely. "But I tell you the truth, it's stranger than anyone could have imagined." Sir Henry, his face grim, added, "The doctor gave a vague certificate. Heart failure, shock, nothing definitive. But the worst part? Less than a month after the funeral, an exhumation was requested. The result? Nothing, no poison, no clear cause of death. And that's when I knew," said Sir Henry, his voice heavy with suspicion. This case is smoke without fire. But why? What was the point of it all?" Mrs. Bantry leaned in, her voice trembling with intrigue. "The most curious part, Zara, the fortune-teller, and that letter. Who was she really? What's her role?" A chill swept through the room. The answers were there, but only for those brave enough to seek them. Colonel Bantry frowned. She appeared out of nowhere, then vanished like smoke. Mrs. Bantry shuddered. "That's unsettling. And Nurse Care, she never heard of Zara either." Dr. Lloyd nodded. "Strange, indeed, but we can only guess." Miss Marple's soft voice interrupted. "Has Mr. Pritchard married Miss Instu?" she asked, eyes glinting with curiosity. Sir Henry raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Seems important," Miss Marple said, her gaze sharp. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "Well, have they?" Colonel Bantry sighed. "We thought so, but 18 months and no word." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Very important," she said softly. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think the same as I do?" Before Miss Marple could answer, Colonel Bantry cut in, warning, "Dolly, this is pure speculation." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I have a theory," she whispered, leaning in. "What if Jean Insto disguised herself as Zara, as a joke? But if Mrs. Pritchard died of fright—" Mrs. Bantry gasped. "You mean, not from fright," Miss Marple said. "But if I were to kill someone, it would be calculated." The room went silent, the tension thickening. "And don't forget," Dr. Lloyd added, "the gossip. George mixing weed killer, serving his wife hot milk, and when they exhumed her there was nothing." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "The truth is hiding, but only for those who dare to look." The room fell silent as Dr. Lloyd murmured, "Nurses know things. They can't always speak, but they know." His words hung in the air like a weight. Sir Henry leaned in. "Miss Marple," he coaxed, "what do you think happened?" Miss Marple's blue eyes sparkled as she spoke. "Sometimes the truth is right in front of us, but only the observant can see it." Colonel Bantry added, "Don't forget, George was seen mixing weed killer, and the gossip spread like wildfire." "And that's where the mystery deepens," Dr. Lloyd said. "The doctors couldn't explain it. No poison, no clear cause. That's why they exhumed her body." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The truth is often stranger than we think. But we're only scratching the surface." Suddenly, Miss Marple's tone shifted. "This reminds me of a village tragedy," she said. "Sometimes things get out of hand." Sir Henry raised an eyebrow. "You mean Nurse Care?" "No," Miss Marple replied, shaking her head. "Nurse Coupling. She was close to Mr. Pritchard, too close." The room went still. Colonel Bantry asked cautiously, "Are you suggesting—" Miss Marple cut him off. "Nurse Coupling became attached to Mr. Pritchard. When she learned about Miss Instow, everything changed. She tried to harm him, and the letter came into play." "What letter?" Sir Henry asked. "The one Nurse Coupling wrote to the so-called fortune-teller, who never existed," Miss Marple revealed. "It was her own disguise." Everyone stared, stunned. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. She wanted to stay close to Mr. Pritchard, and when Mrs. Pritchard might have recognized her, that's when the real plan unfolded. The room was heavy with the implication. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. "The cyanide, the blue flowers, that was just the camouflage. The real plan was far more insidious." "Ah, the cyanide," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but deadly certain. "It was in the smelling salts. I saw the gardener mixing cyanide with water. It looked like smelling salts, and Nurse Coupling could have easily swapped the bottles." Everyone was frozen, stunned. "But why?" Mrs. Bantry whispered, her face pale. Miss Marple's smile was faint, but knowing. "It leaves no trace. If Mrs. Pritchard had been using it regularly, she wouldn't have noticed. And when Mr. Pritchard left to call the doctor, Nurse Coupling could have made the switch." Sir Henry leaned forward, tension rising. "And the blue geranium?" "Ah, a clever trick," Miss Marple replied with satisfaction. "Litmus paper. The ammonia from the smelling salts changed the color, an illusion, just like the cyanide swap." Sir Henry blinked, caught off guard. "But the flowers weren't blue when they first broke in." "No," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with quiet triumph. "Only after Nurse Coupling made the swap did the blue hue appear. Deception, pure and simple." The room hung in silence, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. Miss Marple's tone softened. "It's a tragedy, really. Nurse Coupling's obsession led her down this dark path. And now Miss Instow and Mr. Pritchard can know the truth. No more doubts." As the weight of her words settled, Miss Marple's voice turned steady, cutting through the tension. "Temptation, once allowed, takes root like a weed, spreading until there's nothing left but darkness." The room absorbed her words, and Sir Henry spoke with a wry smile. "I believe we've solved it, but Christie's mystery of human nature remains." Miss Marple nodded, thoughtful. "Agatha Christie didn't just write about crimes. She understood people, their motives. She's the queen of crime for a reason." With a final smile, Miss Marple added, "And her stories, timeless mysteries about the human soul, will live on forever, character that would define her career." Over the next decades, she wrote 66 detective novels and 14 short story collections, an astonishing feat, really. Her works were translated into countless languages, Miss Marple continued, her voice becoming slightly more animated, making her one of the best-selling authors in history. And let's not forget The Mousetrap, which still holds the record for the longest-running play in the world. She truly changed the landscape of crime fiction, Miss Marple concluded, her voice warm with admiration. Her legacy continues to captivate readers around the globe, even decades after her passing in 1976. Yes, and her sharp wit, her clever plots, and her deep understanding of human nature are what make her stories so enduring, Sir Henry remarked. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. That's exactly it. Agatha Christie didn't just write mysteries. She wrote about life itself, with all its complexities and contradictions. As the conversation wound down, Miss Marple's voice softened again, as though she were speaking directly to those who would come after. And that's why stories like The Blue Geranium resonate so deeply. They remind us of the fragility of life, the choices we make, and the secrets we keep. Sir Henry chuckled. "It's a good thing we're not in a mystery, or I might be a suspect myself," he said, trying to lighten the mood. Miss Marple smiled gently, her gaze fixed on him with a knowing look. "Oh, Sir Henry, don't worry," she said with a glint in her eye. "In real life, the most important mysteries are often the ones we never solve." With a final sigh, Miss Marple stood up, ready to conclude the evening's discussion. "Well, that's enough for now. I think we've given Agatha Christie the respect she deserves. Her works continue to inspire us, and I'm sure they'll keep thrilling readers for generations to come." "Indeed," Sir Henry agreed, "and that's something worth celebrating. As long as there are mysteries to solve, there will always be a place for stories like hers." Miss Marple smiled, content in the knowledge that the world would continue to be intrigued by the complexities of human nature, thanks, in no small part, to Agatha Christie's legacy. "Thank you, everyone, for your insights and your time tonight," Miss Marple said, nodding to each person at the table. "And remember, no matter how complex the mystery seems, there's always a way to find the truth. One just needs to keep their eyes, and their minds, open." And with that, the evening came to a close, leaving everyone with more questions than answers, but a deep sense of satisfaction in having shared the experience of unraveling another tale.